Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today. Look, if you've ever stopped and wondered who is actually pulling the strings at the world's biggest companies, or how massive corporate disasters are prevented, or, let's be real, sometimes completely ignored, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're going to follow the power of global corporate governance. We're unpacking exactly how the money flows, who gets to make the rules, and how these massive systemic structures actually try to keep corporate greed in check. We have some seriously fascinating ground to cover, and my goal is to leave literally no stone unturned, so you walk away with a complete, comprehensive grasp of how this whole machine works. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the power players, the institutional investors. Second, the field, meaning the two main ownership systems dominating the globe right now. Third, we'll flip through the governance rulebooks. Fourth, we'll talk global standards and stewardship. And finally, we'll land right in the strict, rules-based reality of the United States.
So conceptually, I want you to think of everything we're talking about today as tracing a giant loop. It all starts with the institutional investors, who they are and the unique problems they face. Then, that flows into the actual ownership structure of the companies they're investing in, whether those companies are run by insiders or outsiders. And finally, both of those powerful forces pour right into the corporate governance codes that dictate the actual rules of the game. Keep that loop in the back of your mind as we go.
Right, part one, power players. We're talking about institutional investors. To really understand the landscape, you have to grasp the sheer explosion of power these institutions have captured over the last few decades. It is honestly staggering. Consider this. Back in the 1950s in the US, institutional investors owned a tiny 7% of the shares on the New York Stock Exchange. Fast forward to 2010, boom, that number rocketed to 67%. They've become the absolute largest owners of shares in many listed companies. And because they hold the lion's share of the votes, well, they hold the ultimate influence over corporate boards.
But here's where it gets complicated. This massive consolidation of wealth creates what we call a deep agency chain. Basically, every layer of separation, from the everyday saver to the pension fund to the manager to the corporate board, introduces a whole new set of conflicting interests. For instance, investment managers might get paid based on the sheer size of the fund they manage, rather than how well it actually performs. Or they might just lazily match a stock market index, pouring money into poorly performing companies simply because they're on a list. Worse still, they might prioritize short-term targets, essentially forcing company directors to ditch smart, long-term strategies just to hit those quarterly numbers.
Now, you might be wondering, do these investors ever actually use their power to stop the madness? And this brilliantly illustrates that yes, they do. When institutions actually flex their muscles, the results are undeniable. In 2021, a record number of S&P 500 companies literally saw their executive pay packages rejected by shareholders. Over half of the shareholders in the oilfield services firm Halliburton voted down the CEO's massive $22.3 million pay plan. This wasn't just a plain suggestion, it was an organized revolt by institutional investors stepping in and saying, all right, enough is enough. Sure, their ultimate sanction is just selling their shares, but their voting power, that is undeniably a formidable weapon.
Moving on to part two, the field. Let's look at ownership systems.
The absolutely crucial point here is understanding the deep divide between insider systems and outsider systems. Insider systems heavily dominate Europe, Asia, and Latin America. In these systems, ownership is super concentrated. Think founding families, the state, or major banks holding all the cards. It's heavily relationship-based. Now, the massive advantage here is a long-term view. Family honor is literally at stake. And the owners are often the managers themselves, so you don't have that messy agency problem we just talked about. But the downside, minority shareholders have very little legal protection, and you run a real risk of funds being misused or sort of tunneled to other family interests. On the complete flip side, we have outsider systems, which you see a lot in the US and the UK. These are your classic dispersed joint stock companies. Ownership and management are totally separated, and funding comes from a massive public stock market. Because of this dynamic, outsider systems had to develop incredibly robust legal governance to protect minority shareholders, and the constant threat of a hostile takeover acts as a brutal but very effective disciplining mechanism.
Let's look at how this plays out in the real world with a classic high-stakes insider example, the saga of Porsche and Volkswagen. For decades, the Porsche and Pike families absolutely dominated these companies. In the late 2000s, Porsche SE,
which was 90% owned by the families, tried to take over VW. Well, it didn't quite work out, so they just flipped the script, and VW ended up acquiring Porsche AG. Because the families completely controlled the voting power, the deal was practically guaranteed to go through. They orchestrated this massive merger that saved billions in costs, but the minority shareholders? They were left incredibly unhappy, missing out on special dividends and other potential takeovers. It perfectly highlights the cultural complexity of a family-run insider system. The family's vision dictates the reality, and external shareholders kind of just have to go along for the ride.
Okay, that brings us to part 3, the governance rulebooks. How do we actually regulate this? Because of these wildly different ownership cultures across the globe, two fundamentally different regulatory philosophies emerged: principles-based versus rules-based systems. The UK champions the principles-based approach. It focuses heavily on the spirit of the law and broad objectives rather than strict, unyielding formulas. Its trademark is the comply or explain regime. Basically, a company must comply with the governance code or explicitly explain to its shareholders exactly why it didn't. It's flexible, it's adaptable, and it avoids massive regulation overload. In stark contrast, we have the rules-based approach, which is heavily favored in the US. This focuses on definite, measurable achievements. It is literally a legally binding checklist. You either complied or you broke the law. There are no shades of gray here. And while that provides a very clear standard and definitely promotes public confidence, it is rigid. It's incredibly costly to implement, and sadly, it often results in companies trying to exploit loopholes rather than just embracing genuinely good ethics.
Let's shift gears to part 4, global standards and stewardship.
With trillions of dollars constantly crossing international borders, we really needed a unified language. And this is exactly where the International Corporate Governance Network, or ICGN, stepped in. Founded by major institutional investors way back in 1995, the ICGN created a sort of global passport of best practices. Their global governance principles demand that boards act in the long-term interest of the company, with a truly diverse mix of competent directors. They require the board to establish a high-standard corporate culture and proactively oversee risk. Crucially, they insist that executive pay be aligned with sustainable value creation and that the rights of all shareholders, especially the minority ones, are fiercely protected. Now, these aren't legally binding, but they absolutely serve as the ultimate benchmark for well-governed companies globally.
But here is the kicker. The ICGN doesn't just put demands on the companies, it puts demands on the investors themselves through its stewardship principles. Institutional investors are expected to monitor investee companies, actively engage with management, exercise their voting rights really carefully, and integrate environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, factors directly into their strategies. Look at BlackRock, literally the world's largest asset manager with over $9 trillion under management. They have an entire dedicated investment stewardship team that regularly engages with companies on board diversity, risk, and corporate strategy. They argue that this hands-on engagement is absolutely essential for long-term value creation.
Finally, we've arrived at part 5, the rules-based reality. Specifically, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. To truly understand SOX, you have to understand the trauma that birthed it. In the early 2000s, massive, high-profile corporate collapses like Enron and WorldCom absolutely shattered public trust in U.S. markets. I mean, the system had failed spectacularly. And when the public loses trust on that massive of a scale, a flexible, principles-based comply or explain approach simply isn't going to cut it. The U.S. government reacted swiftly, passing the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in 2002. It was designed as a heavy-handed, legally binding shock to the system to force compliance and restore public confidence. SOX completely reshaped the corporate landscape. It established a brand new, incredibly powerful regulator called the PCAOB, or the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. This board was given absolutely sweeping powers to set auditing standards, physically inspect accounting firms, and aggressively discipline auditors. The old days of corporate auditors basically marking their own homework, those days were officially over.
And the specific requirements of SOX left absolutely zero room for error. The law actually mandates that corporate audit, nomination, and remuneration committees must be made up of 100% independent directors. Furthermore, the CEO and CFO must personally certify that their company's financial reports are accurate and that their internal controls are effective. And if they lie, they face severe legal penalties, including prison time. Finally, auditors are strictly limited from providing other lucrative non-audit services to their clients just to prevent any possible conflicts of interest. It's a costly, highly rigid, one-size-fits-all system that honestly even drove some initial public offerings away from New York, but it sent a very clear, unyielding message. These rules are not suggestions.
So we've covered an immense amount of ground today, right? We've traced the flow of power all the way from everyday savers up to the highest levels of global corporate law. But I want to leave you with this final, truly provocative thought. You are a part of this massive agency chain. Your hard-earned savings fund the institutional investors who ultimately decide the fate of the world's largest companies. So ask yourself, now that you know who actually holds the strings, does your pension fund or mutual fund vote the way you want them to? Think about it. It's your money. Maybe it's time to find out exactly how it's being used. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive in today's Explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning the system, and I'll see you next time.